Thanks for joining us on the program today, everyone. I'm Millicent Walker in Lagos, Nigeria. Here's what's coming up on the world today. More overnight raids by Israel in Gaza as ground forces begin to move into the Gaza Strip. Manhunt continues for a shooter who killed 18 people in Maine, the United States. Plus, at least 27 people killed in disastrous Hurricane Otis in Mexico. Thanks again for joining us. Hamas says about 50 hostages have been killed by its fighters in Gaza as a result of Israel's bombardment since October the 7th. No details have been given, but Israeli military has identified 224 hostages being held by Hamas in Gaza. Meanwhile, leaders of 27 European Union countries are currently meeting to discuss the conflict in the Middle East. They are expected to present a united front after a week of what some have described as diplomatic gaffes. Spain, Portugal and Ireland are more attuned with the Palestinian cause and are calling for a ceasefire. But countries such as Germany, Austria and Hungary have a more pro-Israel stance and opposed to a ceasefire. Some predict that should the EU call for a humanitarian pause in the conflict, it would be tricky given the divergent views. Earlier today, Israeli President hailed Yusuf al-Ziander, the man who drove his bus into danger to rescue people attempting to flee the attack by Hamas at a music festival, a hero. Herzog says the Bolton Israeli driver told him, "I am an Israeli citizen and I knew I had to go in and save them." We're back in Gaza now, where Palestinians have been told to move south for their own safety by the Israeli military. This even though shells are falling on the southern city of Khan Yunis, where hundreds of people are searching for bodies following Israeli airstrikes earlier today. The Hamas radio said a while ago Nasser Hospital received the bodies of 77 people killed in the airstrikes overnight, most of them women and children. Israel has not responded to the report, but says its forces struck a Hamas missile launch post in the Khan Yunis area that was next to a mosque and a kindergarten. It's not clear if both sides were referring to the same incident. The United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian Refugees in the Near East says more than 613,000 people made homeless by the war are sheltering in 150 UNRWA facilities across the territory. As the war continues, doctors in Gaza say patients arriving at hospitals are showing signs of diseases caused by overcrowding and poor sanitation as they flee the fighting. Aid agencies have repeatedly warned of a health crisis in the crowded Palestinian enclave, which has been under Israeli blockade. Footage provided by Palestine group media shows black smoke rising from Gaza's skyline today as Israel carries out weeks of intense bombardment of the densely populated Gaza Strip. According to Hamas, over 7,000 Palestinians have been killed in the airstrikes, including 2,913 children. Well, speaking of loss, that's how Leo Perry felt when his 79-year-old father was taken hostage by Hamas on October the 7th until he finally got a sign of life from him. Released hostage 80-year-old Yoshev Lefshit yesterday spoke about him, saying he is alive and well. Perry says his father had his wife the night of October the 7th by hiding her behind a sofa and giving himself up instead. He was a witness to the 1967 and 1973 major wars. He had dedicated his life to peace, becoming a volunteer for the Israeli organization Road to Recovery. Meanwhile, relatives from kibbutz attacked by Palestinian gunmen have staged a protest outside Israel's defense ministry, calling on the government to facilitate the safe return of those held by Hamas in Gaza. Kav Aza, just 3 kilometers from the Gaza Strip, was among the communities hit hardest by the Hamas assault on southern Israel on October the 7th, which left 1,400 dead in Israel. The Israeli military says that the number of people confirmed held hostage in the Strip since the cross-border raids by Hamas had reached 224 and could rise further. One Palestinian family affected by the shelling of the IDF in Gaza is the Shamale family. They lost a young child because there was no fuel to transfer him to another hospital and no medicine to treat him where he was. He was wrapped in a small white blanket. The body of Elias Abu Shamale was placed in a grave by his father, Ibrahim Abu Shamale. Elias was wounded during an airstrike by Israel, which has been bombarding the Hamas-run enclave since October the 7th attacks in southern Israel. Elias's mother and an unknown number of siblings were killed in the strike. Shamale said they wanted to take Elias to a private hospital to save him. And Israeli Defense Forces have released footage showing its troops arriving at a kibbutz attacked by Hamas militants. The CCTV video showed soldiers said to be from the Shaldak Special Forces unit arriving on the scene, escorting civilians in the Be'eri kibbutz on October the 7th. Reuters was able to confirm the location of the footage by comparing fences, road layouts, trees and signs with satellites and also far imagery of the area. Previously released CCTV videos of the attack also showed the same scene. Is VOA's Christina Crescendo. Thanks, Christina, for joining us at this time. Tell us about the situation with reporters and journalists on ground covering both sides. What have you heard? This is regarding how they are navigating their way through the war.
No, as we have seen through different reports covering the Israel Gaza war has been very difficult for reporters. The Committee to Protect Journalists, as of today, has 24 journalists dead within those 7,000 people that have died through this conflict. Among the challenges that they face is their own safety and the safety of their family. We saw a report that Al Jazeera's bureau chief in Gaza, Wael Daoud, sadly had to pick up his family, wife, daughter, and I think his grandson, and take them to the hospital because they were killed in an attack by Israel forces. So this conflict has been very difficult to journalists. Within the VOA agency, we have several reporters on the ground as well. Transportation, safety, being very centered and non-biased within this conflict has also been difficult with reporters on the ground as well, because they have to report and be very, centered on what they're doing on the ground and be not emotional at it at some point. But it has been one of the most challenges for reporters, as we have seen and we have heard from experts and also reporters on the ground on how they're trying to balance, their personal life, their safety. Also, if it's a reporter from Gaza or a reporter from Israel, how to keep their family safe as well.
Indeed, it must be a very difficult time for these journalists and also their families that have lost loved ones. For the journalists who have died in the course of covering the war, how is the news usually broken to their families, who have to live with the loss?
Well, if we see the case of, Wael Abdullah, I think he was reported that, this camp, while you're reporting, this camp was attacked. So he personally went to the place and brought his family to the hospital. There's video on the web where you see him, I think, carrying his grandson. So sometimes reporters, because while they're doing their jobs, they find out that their families have been lost, sadly. So usually, you tend to tell the reporters as kindly as possible when something like this happens, through organizations, through people. But it's a very, as I imagine, through what experts have told me, difficult situation to be neutral or to keep, calm in this situation where you're trying to balance both things.
So are there specific steps for healing, for recovery? And, does he go back into reporting? Does he take time off?
Well, the Community to Protect journalists have on their website different aspects on how to approach this. Sometimes reporters feel that they can't cover this, so they need to have time off of work. Of course, if they have a loss in their family and if they're reporting on that conflict and they have a loss in their family. So they go through steps of looking for counseling, looking for, the agency or the organization that they work for. Of course, they need to ask them if they feel comfortable to going back to this, circumstance. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't, depending on how painful. But also, experts have analyzed how post-traumatic stress cannot, maybe in the moment, is not triggered, but maybe a couple of months later, a couple of years later, those reporters, they can be affected for life for what happened.
Do you think journalists are protected enough? And this is for journalists who really are on the front lines, war zones. Who bears the responsibility?
I cannot talk for myself in that sense, but what I have noticed through our different reporting and through what the Community to Protect journalists, RSF, other, defense organization for journalists, is that they can never be safe enough. There's some safety protocols that can take place, physical safety in the sense of, wearing a helmet, wearing a life vest, so not a life vest, but something that they can protect from bullets. But in the sense of protections, also mental health. So it depends on the agency. What experts tell me, a reporter can never be safe enough, but it's good to have protocols in place within the different agencies or workplace that they do, that they can go prepared to be safe, or, the most safe that they can be while covering the war, on, where to go, what to do when there's a mass shooting, what to do when there's a bomb, what to do there's mass casualties, if a colleague is injured or not. So it depends on the agency, how the reporter is prepared, but always what organizations through our interviews tell us is just they need to be prepared, not only physically, with the right equipment, but also mentally to know what they're going to be, or to be prepared to what they're going to be witness of when they're covering this type of conflict.
And indeed, in this particular case, this involving Israel, the Hamas situation, and then, those in Gaza, for journalists, of those who have had a personal loss, this also might affect their psyche, especially it might lead to them taking sides, and that's not an option for journalists covering this kind of zone.
Definitely, and that's why the editor, supervisor, or in the case if it's a freelancer, they have to take a step back. Within what different experts tell me are that if you feel a conflict of interest, you have to tell your editor, I'm not ready for this, I can't do this, I'm too emotionally involved in this. So I think it's always, as part of journalism, we have to take that step back and see, can I cover this in a neutral way? Is it affecting me in the sense of, I don't feel comfortable writing about this or reporting about this because I think it's just affecting me personally. So it's a very difficult work to do, and you have to be aware that it may affect you personally, and also it may affect you, in the long term. Saying okay, I covered this story, I did this, but maybe I wasn't, comfortable doing it. So you have from the get-go tell people, or tell your editors, supervisors, I don't want to do this, or I can't do this in the right way because I'm too emotionally involved. That's sometimes what experts, tell me through our interviews and through the coverage that we have done.
An ideal situation for journalists covering war zones. What could the United Nations actually do to protect journalists and their families?
Within the United Nations, I know they're very advocate on protecting press freedom and the reporter's right and the journalist's right to work. It's within our, within the statement of if there's not a reporter on the ground doing the work, so people will not know what's going on in a neutral way. We have seen a lot of disinformation campaigns, misinformation campaigns within this, Hamas-Israel war, and it's critically important that journalists are on the ground, neutral journalists on the ground who can talk about what's going on. So I think one of the calls for the United Nations has been, of course, to always defend free press and, reporters able to do their work.
We'll continue to pray for all journalists and their families. Many thanks, VOA's Christina Caricedo. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Welcome back. Turkish President Tayyip Erdogan says that Western countries were disregarding the human rights violations in Gaza because the blood being spilled is Muslim blood. In a speech at his presidential palace, Erdogan said Israel's attacks on Gaza had turned into a barbarism and criticized Western countries for providing unconditional support for Israeli attacks instead of calling for restraint. Turkey supports Palestinians, backs a two-state solution to the decades-old Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and hosts members of militant group Hamas. Although Ankara was working to mend ties with Israel before the fighting began, it has toughened its stance against Israel as fighting and the humanitarian crisis in Gaza intensified. Well, thousands of Spanish students have protested today in solidarity with Palestinian people and against Israeli actions in Gaza during a general strike in central Madrid, holding Palestinian flags, chanting slogans as "It's not war, it's genocide" or "Free Palestine." Protesters marched from Sol Square to Spanish Foreign Ministry. Some of them felt anger and said European governments should stop supporting Israel, while others just asked for more shovels and bags to bury the dead bodies in the Gaza Strip. Israel has vowed to wipe out Hamas, which rules Gaza, in retaliation for an October 7th attack that killed 1,400 people by imposing a siege on the enclave of 2.3 million people and preparing a ground invasion. Hamas-run Gaza authorities say more than 6,500 have been killed. In an UNRWA camp for displaced Palestinians in Gaza, people are suffering food and water shortages. Omar Al-Namera, the respondent, says the only good thing about the camp was that it is so far safe from bombardment, but he and others are forced to drink polluted water and only have half a loaf of bread to eat once every 2 days. UNRWA workers have been dealing with the aid that managed to enter Gaza, sorting it out in warehouses and later delivering it to those in need. UN worker Bassem Abu Leia says there are several severe shortages in food supplies, fuel and medications. Humanitarian deliveries through Rafah began on October the 21st. UN agencies say they are not nearly enough to meet the needs of 2.3 million population in Gaza, where clean water, food, medicines and fuel are running low. Israeli efforts to rehabilitate southern communities ravaged by the October 7th Hamas onslaught will take years and go beyond a planned ground offensive in the Gaza Strip. That's according to a member of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's war cabinet, Benny Gantz. Mr. Gantz, an ex-general who joined Netanyahu from the opposition in an emergency government, signaled to enemies of Israel other than Hamas that they too risked being destroyed. He said in a speech earlier, the battle against Gazan terror will continue within the Strip's territory, going deep anywhere and at any time required to ensure security for the communities that will be restored and will rebuild the region. continuing. He said the ground maneuver will be but one stage of a long process that will be defensive, diplomatic, and social aspects that will take years. Israel has vowed to annihilate Hamas, which is sworn to its destruction and has the support of Iran and Hezbollah in Lebanon. And the U.S. Army has charged Private Travis King with crimes ranging from desertion for running into North Korea in July to assault against fellow soldiers and solicitation of child pornography. The Army's case against King, which has not been previously reported, includes 8 distinct charges under the Uniform Code of Military Justice, setting up a substantial legal battle for the 23-year-old soldier after his release from North Korean custody in September. Now, in a statement provided by a family spokesperson, King's mother, she expressed unconditional love and asked that her son be afforded the presumption of innocence. Hundreds of police fanned out across Maine looking for a U.S. Army reservist with a history of mental health issues sought in connection to mass shootings at a bowling alley and a bar in the city of Lewiston, with news outlets reporting a death toll ranging from 16 to 22 and dozens more wounded. Officials said there were multiple casualties in Wednesday evening attacks, but declined to provide figures. Police told residents to stay indoors, and schools across the area were closed on Thursday. Now, state police identified Robert Card, who reportedly had been committed to a mental health facility over the summer, as a person of interest. They circulated photographs of a bearded man in a brown hooded sweatshirt and jeans at one of the crime scenes, armed with what appeared to be a semi-automatic rifle. Maine State Police also found a white SUV they believed drove to the town of Lisbon, about 7 miles to the southeast. And there he urged people to remain indoors in both Lewiston and Lisbon. Well, early today, police also told residents in the town of Bowdoin, about 12 miles east of Lewiston, to shelter in place. Card lives, and this is in case indeed he surfaces. Apparently he lives in Bowdoin, and that's according to the public records the police has. The Republican Mike Johnson, the newly elected Speaker of the House, some would say finally, has vowed to get the U.S. Congress to work, and this is, he says, as hard as it's ever worked, and support Israel. Surrounded by fellow Republicans on the steps of the House, Johnson thanked his party colleagues for a unanimous vote and said he would dispense with ceremony and celebration to get to work on the American people's business. The U.S. House of Representatives elected Johnson, a conservative with little leadership experience, as Speaker on Wednesday, ending a turbulent 3 weeks that left the rudderless chamber unable to carry out any of its basic duties. The 220 to 209 party line vote elevated Johnson to the powerful role that has been vacant since Kevin McCarthy was ousted October 3rd by a small group of his fellow Republicans.
What we need in this country is more hope. The people have lost their faith in our institutions. Their faith is at an all-time low. And one of the reasons they've lost it is because the Congress, over the years, has not delivered for the American people well enough. We're in the majority right now. We've gone through a little bit of suffering. We've gone through a little bit of character building. And you know what it's produced? more strength, more perseverance, and a lot of hope. And that's what we're about to deliver to the American people. We're going to speak with clarity and conviction and consistency to the American people. We're going to tell them what we're for, what agenda we are pursuing, and why it is best for every American, why it will give them more liberty, opportunity, and security. We're going to speak to that clearly. We're going to act consistently. And we're going to exhibit two things here, trust and teamwork. And this group will deliver for the American people. I said it in the chamber, and I will say it here. We're going to govern well. And I think the people are going to be very pleased with those results. We're so grateful. I'm so grateful and so humbled to have gotten a unanimous vote on the floor by all of my colleagues here.
Our Washington, D.C. correspondent Maria Bird joins us now. Maria, good to see you. Let's begin with the shooting in Maine. What really happened?
This is, I think, something that was not expected, of course. This was another time where the American people are seeing that there is no place safe in the United States. And so, as we know, the whole town is shaken by what has occurred. They are extremely concerned about what we could potentially foresee in the coming months and weeks ahead in places like the town of Lewistown, which is the second largest city in the state of Maine, and the 535th mass shooting in the United States, according to the gun violence organizations that have been tracking these over this year. So we are in a very challenging time, to say the least. When you look at the number of lives that were lost as a result of this mass shooting, as you mentioned, there were two different places where this actually occurred. This occurred in a bowling alley on youth night, which means there were children there, and then also occurred in a bar. And these are several miles away from one another. And as you know, there's still the manhunt looking for the shooter, the individual that carried out this very mass attacks. One of the things that has become very clear and apparent in America is the question around banning guns or banning assault rifles such as these. And the question is, are Americans not in agreement for banning assault rifles or guns in general? And so I think there's going to be further efforts to really put forth legislation to at least begin with these assault weapons that are taking out more than 1, 2, 3. Any life, obviously, is a devastating for the country. But taking out, in this case, one report say 22, most recent reports are saying 18. And we really won't know, I think, until a couple more days.
So it appears the shooter is still on the run. Has there been any more information about him? Because I was reading about some of the towns where the police had told residents to stay indoors, to be alert.
Well, they're hoping that he is not trying to escape. So they have all the bordering states around Maine are actually under police protection at this time to ensure he does not try to cross state lines. But he could be in hiding somewhere. And so I think that's what they're doing at this time, trying to see what would be a likely place that he would be during this time if he still is in the general region of the Lewistown city.
And we also heard that this person of interest has a history of mental, health issues. Based on the statistics from perhaps what you've heard, would you say that most of the shootings are as a result of people, that have mental issues?
Well, there has been some tie to mental health issues in some of the individuals that have carried out these mass attacks. And the question is around these mental health organizations, or when someone does go in for mental health evaluation, what is being done on the follow-up? There have been legislations put forth that are requiring individuals to have mental health checks before they're able to purchase assault rifles. So these types of occurrences, unfortunately, they have to happen in order to revisit some of these very serious regulations that really are going to be required in order to kind of move away from what we're seeing in the U.S. as an increase in mass shootings.
Well, Maria, let's move away slightly from the shooting and talk about the voting yesterday. What more do we know? There's a new speaker in town.
There is a new speaker in town. It took 3 weeks. As we know, the ousted speaker, former Speaker McCarthy, was ousted, and there was a tremendous amount of effort being put in place to ensure that there was another speaker. Unfortunately, there were several failed votes. But it appears as if the party came together. There were initially about 9 candidates that were brought forth. It ended up being around 8. And as we can see, the one that ended up being the victor in this situation is Mike Johnson. He's out of Louisiana. He is a Trump ally. So the question is this setting a precedent for where the country could be moving forward, especially as we're beginning to enter into the next presidential election cycle. And so he is a known Trump ally. And so what will that do for the party? And what will that actually do really for the Congress and him leading the House? And as he said, he's getting right to work to address some of the things that have been on backlog for 3 weeks.
What do we know about how the Democrats view him? What sorts of concessions did he make, to convince the Democrats to also back him?
Well, the Democrats, he won obviously by a slight majority of Republicans. And so the Republicans are the majority in the House. And so there's not been really any Democrats that are supporting him. And some of the Republicans that might have been on the fence or might have not been strong Trump allies that felt the need for ensuring that American people are able to have a speaker was more important than necessarily not voting him in. And so those are the individuals that really voted him in. Democrats are going to obviously have a very tough time over the next few weeks and months as we're looking for this next cycle into the presidential election season. And so this is going to definitely be something that will challenge many Democrats, but nothing they haven't seen before. They will continue to try to work across party lines to get some of the things they hope can happen before Biden administration ends.
We also heard him say that the U.S. Congress, saying he's going to get the U.S. Congress to work as hard as it's ever worked and also to support Israel. Do you think that is something that reverberates, for members of the Congress?
Yes, members of the Congress are definitely feeling like, that's what they're saying. But of course, we know congressional members are late nights, early mornings, weekends, just due to the passion of the job and the work of the American people that has to be done. So I think that resonates, but I don't think it's anything they're not ready for or used to. And just also clarify my point around former our President Biden. It's not until he goes for re-election. And so I think that's what the Democrats are going to really focus on is really trying to get some things done before we look at the next election cycle.
So, Maria, we can say that the U.S. government is back in business.
It's back in business. There's a lot to take care of. November 17th is the deadline for the current stay on the budget. And so, unfortunately, if we don't see another bill pass on November 17th, we could be talking about government shutdown again.
All righty. We'll continue to look to you for those updates. Many thanks, Maria.
Thank you.
South Africa's Minister of Trade, Industry and Competition, Mr. Ibrahim Patel, says the African Growth and Opportunity Act, AGOA, is vitally important for the economic development of the African continent. Mr. Patel was briefing the media on South Africa's readiness to host AGOA Forum scheduled for November the 2nd to the 4th, 2023. The minister says the Made in Africa Expo will form part of the forum and entrepreneurs from the African continent will have the opportunity to display their products. The Africa Growth and Opportunity Act, AGOA, is a United States of America trade program that provides eligible countries in sub-Saharan Africa with preferential access to the U.S. market.
The official logo you will see here behind us, and you'll see the 3 elements of the partnership. South Africa as the formal host, the United States as the partner, and the African continent as the other co-hosts, because we're really hosting this on behalf of the continent. We've had a meeting with African trade ministers in December last year where we developed a common position on AGOA, and we've had similar meetings between African ambassadors in Washington, D.C., in which they too have worked together on a common position. And so this will be an opportunity for us in the forum to share those views with the United States. Africa and South Africa provides an enormous quantity of the raw materials that is fueling American industrialization. And South Africa alone is the single biggest provider of a number of critical minerals to the US. Of course, similarly, we benefit from American technology, from know-how, and from the jobs that are created here.
And we must say that for the first time in the AGOA summit, for the first time, organized labor will now be included, as the minister has alluded to. And it would be ourselves in South Africa, but also in the African continent with our counterparts in the United States in relation to trade unions, that would also be having a platform to meet and also take our resolve to the main session, so that also business and government are able in civil society to understand what labor thinks of these trade relations.
The United States and Saudi Arabia say they will resume talks in Jeddah aimed at achieving a ceasefire in Sudan. Reports say representatives of Sudan's army and paramilitary rapid support forces, RSF, have arrived in Saudi port city for the talks. Previous peace talks in Jeddah city collapsed in June after numerous ceasefire violations. This latest mediation effort is expected to include an African facilitator from the regional development bloc IGAD. 6 months of conflict between the Sudanese army and the RSF has created a humanitarian catastrophe, with more than 9,000 people killed and about 6 million others displaced. British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak says a report commissioned by his government suggested there was a possibility humanity could lose control of artificial intelligence in extreme cases. Britain will set up the world's first artificial intelligence AI safety institute. Ahead of the gathering he will host next week of representatives of AI companies, political leaders and experts. US Vice President Kamala Harris and Google DeepMind CEO Demis Hassabis are on the guest list. Mr. Sunak wants Britain to be a global leader in AI safety, carving out a role after Brexit between the competing economic blocs of the US, China and the European Union. He said that while AI will boost economic growth, advance human capability and solve problems once thought beyond us, it also brings us new dangers and new fears. He added that only governments rather than tech companies could properly assess the risk to national security stemming from artificial intelligence.
Get this wrong, and AI could make it easier to build chemical or biological weapons. Terrorist groups could use AI to spread fear and destruction on an even greater scale. Criminals could exploit AI for cyber attacks, disinformation, fraud, or even child sexual abuse. And in the most unlikely but extreme cases, there is even the risk that humanity could lose control of AI completely, through the kind of AI sometimes referred to as superintelligence. Now, I want to be completely clear. This is not a risk that people need to be losing sleep over right now. And I don't want to be alarmist. And there is real debate about this. Some experts think it will never happen at all. But however uncertain and unlikely these risks are, if they did manifest themselves, the consequences would be incredibly serious. And when so many of the biggest developers of this technology themselves warn of these risks, leaders have a responsibility to take them seriously and to act. And that's what I'm doing today, in 3 specific ways. Right now, the only people testing the safety of AI are the very organizations developing it. Even they don't always fully understand what their models could become capable of. And there are incentives, in part, to compete to build the best models quickest. So we shouldn't rely on them marking their own homework, as many of those working on this would themselves agree. Not least because only governments can properly assess the risk to national security, and only nation states have the power and legitimacy to keep their people safe. The UK's answer is not to rush to regulate. This is a point of principle. We believe in innovation. It's a hallmark of the British economy.
That's British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak. A small group of pro-Ukrainian protesters today gathered in Brussels to call on EU leaders meeting in the city to strengthen sanctions against Russia and boost arms deliveries to Ukraine. The 27 leaders of EU member countries were set to hold a summit at 1300 GMT, which will discuss support for Ukraine, whilst diplomatic focus is also on the Israel-Hamas conflict. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky will address the summit by video link, and support for Kyiv will have first place in the summit declaration. The EU and its member countries have provided billions of euros in assistance to Ukraine since Russian forces invaded February last year.
We have to send those weapons to Ukraine faster and in bigger volumes, and we have to put strong sanctions on all the possible goods and close all the possible loops that Russia is using.
Leftist leader Roberto Fico has been appointed Slovakia's prime minister for the fourth time after pledging in his election campaign to end military support for Ukraine and criticizing sanctions on Russia. President Zuzana Kaputova appointed Fico and his cabinet after his Smer SSD party won September 30 election and formed a coalition with the centre-left and nationalist SNS parties. Mr. Fico quit as Prime Minister in 2018 amid mass public protests against corruption after a journalist was murdered. This time, he campaigned heavily on pledges to end Slovak official military aid to Ukraine, make foreign policy independent of EU partners and the US, and get tough in keeping out migrants seeking to make it to Western Europe. Fico has also spoken out against political liberalism, the activities of non-government organizations, more rights for transgender people. He's praised neighboring Hungary's leader, Viktor Orban, as a politician defending his country's interests and could make alliances with Orban where their interests meet, while railing against Brussels and the US. Fico has repeatedly said there's no intention to take the country of 5.5 million people out of the EU or the US-led NATO military alliance. And drone views have shown the destruction caused by Hurricane Otis in the Mexican beach resort of Acapulco early on Wednesday, as a rare Category 5 storm and one of the strongest to ever hit Mexico's Pacific coast, battering hotels, ripping off roofs, smashing windows. The hurricane wreaked havoc in the coastal city, causing floods that partly submerged vehicles in streets, encircled stadiums and smashed buildings at the southern state of Guerrero, a work to the disarray left in Otis' wake. There were no immediate reports of fatalities, but authorities stressed that parts of the region were without power or phone signal, making it hard to gain a detailed picture of the destruction. One of the strongest hurricanes ever to hit the region, Otis reached the shore as a Category 5, the strongest level in the 5-step Saffir-Simpson hurricane wind scale, before quickly weakening to a Category 4 storm. Its power slackened further as it moved inland, reducing Otis to a tropical storm and later dissipating over the mountains of southern Mexico. And finally on the programme, popular British pop band The Beatles They've announced the release of their last song more than 50 years since the iconic band broke up. Called Now and Then, it is based in a 1970s demo recording by John Lennon and was completed last year by Sir Paul McCartney and Sir Ringo Starr. The track will premiere 2 p.m. GMT today, November 2nd. Well, not today, November the 2nd, that is. It's also a Thursday. It will also feature on newly remastered versions of the Beatles' Red and Blue albums due on the 10th of November. Originally released in 1973, the career-spanning compilations have been described by Rolling Stone magazine as arguably the most influential greatest hits albums in history. Featuring everything from Love Me Do to The Long and Winding Road, the 2 volumes are essentially divided between the band's early mop-top days, the Red Album, and their more experimental and expansive late period, and that's the Blue Album. Well, that's our show this evening. Thank you for watching. I'm Millicent Walker.